well. I forgot to start the record button, so we're starting here. Thank you for your patience, everybody. So the Kedushas Halevi points out that this particular Parsha is the first time since Matan Torah that Hashem turned to Moshe Rabbeinu and gave Moshe Rabbeinu the instruction, Daber el Bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel. First time. So the Kedushat Halevi says you have to understand the significance of this. What's the significance of this coming right after Matan Torah? Well, just for a moment, consider what experience Moshe had underwent. So when this particular Parsha was actually said, depends on how you understand the chronology of events. But according to some, this Parsha, while it is in the book, it's printed, it comes before the story of Chet HaEgel. According to many Meforshim, it actually chronologically happened after the Chet HaEgel. So just one second. According to the Vilna Gaon, for example, this Parsha follows the Chet HaEgel, but not even immediately. According to the Vilna Gaon, when Moshe came down from Har Sinai, and he was holding the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, he saw the Chet HaEgel. What day was that? That was Shivasar B'Tammuz. So the Torah, the Aseret HaDibrot, were spoken on the 6th day of Sivan, following which Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai. He comes down of Har Sinai on Shivasar B'Tammuz. On Shivasar B'Tammuz, he sees everybody dancing and the big partying going on around the Chet HaEgel. He breaks the Luchot. Hashem, of course, is furious, and he threatens to annihilate the Jewish people, but to continue the tradition, to continue the lineage from Moshe. Moshe then goes up the next day to spend another 40 days on Har Sinai, pleading that God not destroy the Jewish people. He spends another 40 days. And he comes down in the month of Av. Then Hashem calls him and says, okay, I am going now to give you the second Luchot. I agree, I'm not going to destroy them, but now that you destroyed the first set of Luchot, which I'm okay with, you need a second one. So chisel for yourself, Hashem tells Moses, chisel for yourself out 2 stone tablets. This time come back up on Har Sinai, spend another 40 days with me, and then you come down with a second set of Luchot. So Moshe does that, and he comes down. This is the 3rd time he's on Har Sinai. The first time was after the Aseret HaDibrot. The second time was after Shivasar B'Tammuz, when he was pleading for the life of the Jewish people. And now was the 3rd time. So now he comes down, and he comes down on what day? Yom Kippur, the 10th day of Tishrei. And that's why the 10th day of Tishrei has always been associated with the day of forgiveness, because Hashem forgave the Jewish people for the Chet HaEgel. And then the next day, according to the Vilna Gaon, this Parsha is spoken. So let's be very clear. The Kedushas Halevi is telling us that this Parsha, where Hashem says to Moshe, Moshe, now speak to the Jewish people and teach them everything in Parshat Terumah and Tetzaveh, that was spoken when? After Moshe spent how long on Har Sinai? 120 days. 120, not consecutive, but one day in between. He's now come down from Har Sinai after being up there for 120 days. And what does Hashem say to Moshe? Hashem says, Moshe, Daber el Bnei Israel. Rav Levi Yitzchak Miberdichev says you cannot minimize the significance of what seems to be a completely innocuous phrase that is, peppered all through the Chumash, where Hashem says to Moshe, Daber el Bnei Israel. So why is this Daber el Bnei Israel to be seen in any other way? The Kedushas Halevi says because Moshe just spent 120 days in this purity of isolation, in a spiritual elevation that you and I can probably not even imagine. So he's been transported into this height, this world that he almost was in the world of angels. And the ecstasy, the closeness to God was so overwhelming. Then he comes down to earth and Hashem says, did you enjoy that? Good. I'm glad that you did. But now I want to tell you something. Now you have to go and speak to the rest of the people. And they were not like you. They didn't stand on the mountain for 120 days. And they're going to maybe asking a lot of questions. And not everybody's going to be a tzaddik. And not everybody's hands are going to be clean. And I'm using that as a metaphor. And yes, when you were on Har Sinai, you were amongst the angels. It's a perfect existence. Amazing. But now come back to the ground. Come back to the world. And now you have to deal. You need to deal with what goes on with whom? B'nai Yisrael. Daber El B'nai Yisrael. And this is the first time, says the Kedushas Levi, that this happens. And so what appears to be just a few little simple words are imbued with a lot more significance by the Kedushas Levi. And I think the message he's saying is, it's good to be holy, but you can't be holy in isolation from the people. You can't sort of protect yourself and say, I'm not going to get dirty. It's too much. I've worked too hard to become the person I am, to reach the level that I've accomplished, to learn all the things that I now know. I just can't somehow leave that and lower my standards and lower myself. And Kedushas Levi is saying that is precisely what Hashem has asked Moshe Rabbeinu to do. But I think he's also helping him. He's saying, do this. And I'm asking you, I'm instructing you to do it. And it will not result in you being lessened or diminished in any way. So that's the Kedushas Halevi on the notion of Daber El B'nai Yisrael. This whole notion of the construction of a Mishkan is a topic that, oh my goodness, occupies so much of the rabbinic response and interpretation and commentary. Think about it for one moment, of course, and you realize there's a sort of philosophical, maybe even a theological fault line in the whole idea that an infinite God, and we believe that God is infinite. Even the Kabbalistic literature, Hashem is called Ein Sof, which means infinite, no end. So we're taking this Ein Sof, this infinite being, whatever that even means, and Hashem is saying, now I want you to build a house, and here's the measurements, and I want you to, have these things inside the house. How is it even possible to conceptualize, let alone to actually physically construct in this world some sort of dwelling for an infinite power? Like, why would Hashem even want that? And so obviously there's so much written about that in terms of what it represents, what's the symbolism of the Mishkan. But it is understood, it is seen as being a symbolic place, but symbolic of what? So one explanation was written by Rabbi Nissen Alpert, who was a Talmud Muvhak of Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And in his writings on Chumash called Limudei Nisan, he makes an interesting observation. And it's an interesting one because I've seen how this can happen even in school. When you think about, just for 1 second, if you think about how you would teach somebody about Pesach, just think that for a second. So you're probably organizing in your mind, so what will a person need to know about Pesach? And you're probably going through all sorts of, organize this to make sure they understand the kitchen and chametz and matzah. Of course, there's a seder, and there's so much to talk about, right? There's volumes and volumes and volumes. But it's not impossible to talk about Pesach and not mention Hashem so much. It's not impossible, because we're going to get swept up in what? We're going to get swept up in all the details of the law. And in some ways, and this is what Rav Nissen Alpert says, it's sort of like the phrase that we have in English that you can't see the forest from the trees, is that we sometimes are so involved in the minutia, the details, that what do we forget? We forget what lies at the core of this whole thing, which is the relationship of God to the Jewish people. And we don't always talk about that enough, and we don't speak about it enough. And so says Rabbi Alpert in his little commentary on this spot, that sometimes we get so involved, we forget about the whole notion of Yirat Shamayim and how critical that is. And the Mishkan was created to be that structure which reminds us about that. And it's an irony because, of course, the construction of the Mishkan is so detailed. And if you read through Parshat Terumah and read through Parshat Tetzaveh, and then later on at the end of Sefer Shemot by Yakel Pekudei, you'll see, oh my gosh, just how fine the details are, the expectations that every measurement will be matched. But in its entirety, once the Mishkan was constructed, its message, at least one of its messages, was the message of relationship. And that's why when Hashem talks about the purpose of the Mishkan, he says, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Build for me this sanctity, this sanctuary, and v'shachanti, and I will dwell. And we all expect pasuk to end with the word betocho. I will dwell in it. But that's not what the pasuk reads, as you know. It says, build a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell in them. What do you mean in them? The purpose of the sanctuary is not for God to dwell in the sanctuary, because philosophically, of course, that can't happen. The purpose of the sanctuary was to be the symbolic expression of God's presence where? In my heart, in my family's heart, wherever I go. And that's why the Torah specifically says, V'shachanti betocham. And so sometimes we forget about the purpose of what all of this represents. Even a shul, even the beautiful shul that I'm standing in, Sher Shemaim, that I'm deeply connected to, it's a building. That's all it is. But it's what it represents that's much more important than the Aron Kodesh behind me, the icons we use to decorate the shul. It's a symbol of a relationship. And that relationship should be so, quote unquote, portable that even when you step out of the shul, it goes with you. And so that's Nisan Alpert's notion of what's the purpose of the building of the Mishkan, to remind us about the notion of relationships. So let's take a look for a second at some of these specific instructions that Hashem gives the Jewish people. So I'm going to start reading, and here's a list. It begins Pasuk Gimel, and we're just going to read a few Psukim as a list of all the things that Hashem says, okay, here we're going shopping, we're looking for contributions, and here are the specifics that I would like the Jewish people to contribute. First Hebrew, then English. V'zot ha'truma asher tichlu me'itam. And here is the portion that you shall take for them. Zahav, v'chesed, choshet, gold, silver, and copper, techelet, v'argaman, v'tolat, shani, v'shesh, v'izim, and turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, linen, and goat hair, v'orot elim, me'adamim, v'orot tichashim, red dyed ram skins, tachash skins, v'atzei shitim, and acacia wood, shemen lamaor, oil for illumination, bisamim l'shemen hamishcha, spices for anointment oil, and the liktorat hasamim, and the aromatic incense, avnei shoham, ve'avnei miluim, la'ephod v'lachoshen, shoham stones and stones for the settings, for the ephod and the breastplate. And then, of course, the verse which I quoted a minute ago, the pasuk, v'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. And they shall make a sanctuary for me, and I shall dwell among them. So hopefully you are listening to the order. Is there an order? Are these things listed in random order? Nothing is random in the Torah, so that's sort of like a leading question. So I'll read them again in English, and just listen and see if you can discern any sort of order that you can think makes sense. So here it goes. Gold, silver, copper, turquoise, purple, and scarlet wool, linen, and goat hair, red dyed ram skins, tachash skins, acacia wood, oil for illumination, spices for the anointment oil and aromatic incense, shoham stones, and stones for the settings for the ephod and the breastplate. So you may not know everything, but you probably picked up, well, it seems to be in some order, and I'm going to suggest to you that it might seem to be in descending order of value. Okay, starts with gold and silver, and it goes to some, materials, then skins of certain animals, and then we go to oil for various usage, and then we end with precious stones, avnei shoham and avnei milim, precious stones that were inserted in the breastplate and the ephod that the Kohen Gadol wore. So if I'm right that it's in descending order, there's something that's out of order. And what is it? The last two things, avnei shoham and avnei milim, precious stones They don't belong after the skins of animals or goat hair, or even they don't belong after oil. Ask anybody what they think is more valuable, oil or precious stones. You don't have to be an economist. You don't have to be a gem dealer to know, of course, precious stones are more valuable than goat hair. But these appear at the end. They should appear, apparently, at the beginning. So I want to share with you an explanation, interesting explanation offered by Rav Chaim Ibn Attar, or Chaim HaKadosh, in his wonderful, wonderful explanation on the Torah called Or Chaim HaKadosh. So he suggests three answers as to the specific reason that the Avnei Shoam seem to be at the end of this list, where they would ostensibly be considered to be more valuable. So here's his first answer. In order to know his first answer, you need to know a little bit about the story behind the Avnei Shoam and the Avnei Miluim. So what's the story? Rashi tells us the story, and he says that the Avnei Shoam and Avnei Miluim were actually gifts brought, that's true, but by who? By the Nisi'im, the princes of each one of the Shvatim. So they held back when everybody in the people were coming forward with so many things, actually to the point that they had to say, stop to everybody. We have enough. You've given so much. We don't need any more donations. So the Nisi'im did not participate in this overwhelming wave of response that the Jewish people had to God's call for donations for the Mishkan. They had a thought. They said, you know what? We're going to wait. And whatever the people don't donate in order to fill up the required amount of various objects, we'll donate. That's what the Nisi'im were thinking. So the general populace, however, they contributed everything. They gave everything for the Mishkan, even to the point, as I said, that there was a surplus. So the Nisi'im, therefore, gave the precious stones that were not part of the main building fund, because the main building fund had already happened. So, and in fact, the Torah, Hashem is even a little bit critical of what they did. So when the word Nisi'im is written, it's not written with all the letters. Something is missing. It's deficient. Why? Because Hashem is criticizing them for being a little lazy. You did not respond with the fullness of a response that I expected from people in your position. So we would look at their offer as being very admirable. Can you just imagine if the shul, this shul or any shul, was having a campaign and one of the Gevirim got up and said, I'm taking upon myself, no matter what the deficit is, I'm picking up the tab. That would be an amazing, that would be amazing if any shul had people in the shul willing to say that. However, the Torah is critical of their actions. Why? Like, what was wrong with that? So it would seem that the problem with this approach is that they should have realized that in building the Mishkan, there can't be such a thing as a deficit. It's not happening. A deficit means it's a lack of something. Something is missing. But Hashem doesn't need our money. It's not like Hashem needs gold. Oh my gosh, I don't have enough gold to build a Mishkan. Can you guys help me out here? Hashem doesn't need any of it. He didn't need it in the first place. He gave us the opportunity to have a part, to merit participating in the mitzvah. That's what it was. Not that Hashem was missing something, so he needed us. No, he's giving us a chance to participate in the building of the Mishkan, so he calls upon us to contribute. There was going to be enough in this case, no matter what. There was always going to be enough. The question was only who will have the mitzvah of building the Mishkan. And the Nisi'im, the princes, were criticized for losing the opportunity. They didn't step up, so they lost the opportunity. So according to the Or Chaim's answer, this is answer number one, this is why the Shoham stones are mentioned last in the sequence of donations. Even though they were very precious, since this was the gift that came about with a lack of excitement and a lack of enthusiasm, they didn't jump at the opportunity. These stones were relegated to the last place, so to speak, in the enumeration of all of the donations to the Mishkan. Answer number one. Okay. Answer number two. The answer number two, the Or Chaim says, is that everything in the list, everything else in the list, was made kodesh, was made holy, and could not be used for any other purpose except for a holy purpose. It couldn't be used for anything not holy, what we would call secular. However, the shoham stones and the setting stones that were in the bigdei kahuna, the clothing of the kohen, those garments could be used for non-holy purposes, as the Gemara Masechet Yoma tells us. The Kohanim were allowed to wear these clothes, at least for a short time, even while they were quote unquote off duty. And so therefore, says the Or Chaim, because the stones could be used for things, activities that were not considered directly kadosh or kodesh, these gifts did not wind up in the same sort of state as all the other gifts. And therefore, they're mentioned at the end. Okay, answer number 2. Now let's go to the third answer of the Or Chaim's last answer. And according to the last answer, the Or Chaim HaKadosh mentions a midrash, which is what? He says there's a midrash that says that the stones were not donated by human effort. They were brought to the camp. These stones were brought to the Machane Yisrael on heavenly clouds. Heavenly clouds. And they were collected by the Nesi'im, but they were brought to the camp on heavenly clouds. And therefore, they're in a different category than the other donations that were listed first, and therefore they come last. So how do these answers address the original question? And the original question was, it looks like the list of all these things is in descending order. So why were the Shoham and Avnei Miluim stones, which probably were more valuable than anything else in that list, why were they at the end? Why didn't they come at the beginning? So the 3 answers, if you think about them, in fact, are connected. What is it? We say, according to the Or Chaim HaKadosh, that the list is actually in descending value. It's true. It's 100% true. But the value is not determined by what? Monetary value. Value is determined by other measures, by self-sacrifice, and by how much work went into the way in which these things were presented for the purpose of the Mishkan. That's the value. So the list is based on value. And to the premise of the question, aren't precious stones more valuable than spices? Aren't precious stones more valuable than goat hair? The answer is, it all depends. These particular stones were not worth more than spices for any of the reasons mentioned above. So, like a Jew, a person that scrapes together his money and donates spices with much love. So there's somebody amongst Machane Yisrael. He doesn't have that much, or he has spices that mean something special to him or to her, and that's what they want to give to the Mikdash because it means something. They're sacrificing for it. We're going to do without it because we're doing something that we think has a really important purpose. So at face value, its monetary value may look small, fraction of what the other things are. But that's not the way Hashem looked at it, not at all. Value is never determined by what the street value will bring for the commodity. Value is determined by a totally different standard. Hashem has a standard regarding how something is given, which is why the gift of a poor Jew, a poor person, which is given with enthusiasm, way surpasses the gifts of the princes that were given, let's say, lazily. You know, and so it's laid back. We'll wait till everybody, and then we'll pull out our checkbook and we'll cover the check. We'll cover the deficit. So I think the Or Chaim is answering that his original observation is correct. The gifts are, in fact, in descending order. We just need to understand the standard or the scale by which the hierarchy is established. Okay. I like that idea. We're going to go on. Amongst the things that the Torah tells us that had to be built and constructed are called keruvim. It's actually not a word that you can translate. It's transliterated in English, the cherubim. Cherubim are these figures with wings, with the faces of a child, that were built out of a single block of gold and became the cover for the Aron Ha'idut. The Aron Ha'idut was the box, or actually the three boxes, one inside the other, into which the Shnei Luchot HaBrit were put. A cover was placed on top with a gold sort of crown around the edge. And on top of that cover was this chiseled out of a single block of gold, these two figures with wings that are spread out, facing each other, and faces of children. Rav Yosef Salant in the 1800s, not Rav Yisrael Salanter, but Rav Yosef Salant, some say it was Rav Yisrael Salanter, was one of his teachers, wrote a fascinating explanation commentary on Torah called the Be'er Yosef. And he says something fascinating here that we may not remember from our studies of Tanakh. So in Sefer Melachim, in Sefer Kings, the Torah describes for us how the first Beit HaMikdash was built. It was, of course, built by not David HaMelech, who was not given the opportunity to do so, but it was built by his son Shlomo. So in Perek Vav or Zayin, I can't remember, I think it's in Vav, the Torah tells us that Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash, of course, and he built it in a grand way, much bigger than the Mishkan. He was not duplicating this portable traveling shul that the Jewish people had in the desert. But he did do more than that. So while there was the Aron Ha'idut and there were the Kruvim, as I described to you on the Aron Ha'idut, that stage, that structure that was built by the Jews in the desert was transported to Eretz Yisrael, was brought ultimately by David HaMelech, as you may remember. He brought it to Yerushalayim, and there it became home in Yerushalayim until Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash. And when it was built, he took the Aron Ha'idut and put it inside the Beit HaMikdash. But Sefer Melachim tells us that Shlomo built actually two more Kruvim, two more. So there was the two that were built out of the single piece of gold on top of the Aron Ha'idut. But in addition to that, Shlomo HaMelech built two larger Kruvim that were not on top of the Aron Ha'idut, but that were standing on the ground. So ultimately, there were four Kruvim, two on the Aron Ha'idut with the face of children, that Rashi tells us, and these two larger ones, which also had the face of children, but much bigger, much more, the dimensions were much larger, and you can read about that if you want to follow up after the Shiur. Excuse me, you can take a look at Sefer Melachim, Aleph, and take a look, I think it's Perek Vav, and you can find so many of the details. So in his commentary, the Be'er Yosef, the Rabbi Yosef Salant tries to explain to us, so again, what's the symbolism? What's the message here? What was Shlomo HaMelech trying to teach, not only the people of his own time, but we who are reading both Parshat Terumah, where we encountered the first set of Kruvim, or Sefer Melachim, where we're encountering the first and the second set of Kruvim. So Rabbi Salant offers an interesting idea. He says, when Bnei Yisrael were in the desert, they had nothing. Everything that they had, their whole life was being sustained by God. They, as it were a child at the table of a parent, a child who is totally dependent, that has no sustenance without the parent caring for them. That's what the Jewish people were in the desert. Every day, and as you know from the story of the man, but even beyond that, all of the needs of the Jewish people, all of the needs were cared for. The man, the be'er, the clouds. The Torah even tells us that the clothes that they wore on their backs and the shoes that they wore on their feet for 40 years, they never wore out. I mean, they had no Walmart, they had no Yorkdale to go to, so what were they going to do? So Hashem cared for them, made sure that their clothing never wore out. And so every moment that they lived in the desert was a moment of miraculous sustenance, that nothing was missing from them. just like a child, just like that face of the Tinok reminds us of that pure state of dependency. That's what the message of the Kruvim, at least that set of Kruvim in the desert, represents. But they didn't stay in the desert, did they? They entered the land of Israel. And when they entered the land of Israel, a lot of things changed. One of the things that notably changed was they weren't all surrounding the Mishkan anymore. There was every Shevet got its own part of the territory in the land. So everybody spread out and they were no longer together. But not only were they no longer together, that miraculous sustenance that they saw on a daily basis, that changed. So now they entered the land of Israel, the man didn't fall. So how are you going to have your food? You have to farm. And everybody had to now go do their work. And the second set of Kruvim, says Rabbi Salam, that represents the new type of existence that the Jewish people had. They weren't made out of a solid piece of gold resting on top of the Aron Ha'edut, but rather these were Kruvim whose feet were where? On the ground. And it represented that new type of life. It represented the idea of the Jew having to engage in and embrace a different type of existence. But the face of these Kruvim remains, says Rabbi Salant, based on the Torah Shebal Peh, on the Psukim and Sefer Melachim, it remained like the childlike Kruvim of the original set. Why? To remind us that in our state now, we should not make the mistake that some make, that everything that we're doing, we're accomplishing because what? Because of us. We're good at it. Whatever it is we're good at, we're so successful. We've worked for our success. The face of the Kruvim in the desert was a reminder of the dependency of that young child, and the Jewish people as a nation were dependent. But we remain dependent. We may have bigger bodies and we may have different place to live, but it's foolish to think that we're any less dependent on God. That just because we get up in the morning and go to our offices in the day and we have great meetings and we're smart and we're making all these deals, you see how we're great? You're making the deals and you got your office and whatever it is that you have, but you have that because Hashem is still endowed, giving you the blessing of success. And we are no less dependent on God in this new environment that we're in than we were in the desert. So it's an interesting idea what the Kruvim represent. It represents, as it were, a transition. That's why the second set of Kruvim are planted not on the Aron Ha'edut, but planted on the ground. But not to forget, Shlomo HaMelech in his wisdom, not to forget that while things do change, some things do remain the same. And for a Jew to remember that at all times, we really do depend on God's kindness and grace. Sometimes we think when something happens, oh my gosh, the truth is, every single day, it's the same situation. We wake up in the morning because Hashem has given us the opportunity to do so. And at the face of the young cherubim, the Kruvim, remind us just of how dependent we are. That's Rav Yosef Salat. Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, at one point was invited to a Sheva Brachos, and he was asked to speak at the Sheva Brachos. And speaking to the Chassan and Kala at the Sheva Brachos, he used this week's Parsha as a message to the Chassan and Kala. What could you possibly say in this week's Parsha? Okay. So he said an interesting observation. He said, if you take a look at this week's Parsha of Terumah, you know, of course, that there are certain pieces of furniture in the Mishkan that are significant. And he wanted to draw a comparison between the furniture in the Mishkan and to the new home that a Chassan and Kala begin. So Rav Soloveitchik was not interested in saying, okay, these are the pieces of furniture you should buy. This is not the store you should go to. That wasn't the point. But the point he was saying is that there's symbolism in the things in the Mishkan, and that symbolic message should be the same sort of symbolic message that we, in setting up our homes, should be mindful of. And so he pointed out that, of course, the central piece of Torah is the Aron Ha'edut. That's mentioned first. And then there are a series of other things that are mentioned. And what are the other things that are mentioned? They are the Shulchan. They are the menorah, and they are the mizbeach and the altar. And only later, interestingly enough, does the Torah tell us about another piece of furniture in the Mishkan, which was the mizbeach haketoret, the incense, but it's not mentioned with the other three I just told you, shulchan, mizbeach, and menorah. This one, the ketoret, is mentioned later, leading Rav Soloveitchik to think that somehow that occupies a different sort of place in the structure and the overall message of the types of furniture in the Mishkan. So the Rav developed this idea and suggested there's a wonderful story in Navi that teaches us quite a lot about how we set up our home and the type of quote unquote furniture, physical and maybe spiritual, that we place in our home. So you may remember a story that's mentioned in Sefer Malachim, not Malachim Aleph, Malachim Beit, but Elisha Hanavi, and a woman, Ha'isha Hashunamit, who was bereft of children, and she went to Elisha asking that she bless him, and he blesses her with a child. And she's very worried. Says, don't fool around with me. Don't kid me. This is an important thing. And Elisha says, no, next year you will have a son. V'kachaya. And it's true. The blessing of Elisha Hanavi comes true. And the woman is so indebted to Elisha that she says to her husband, Elisha Hanavi travels a lot and he passes by this area. I think we should build him a special part in our home. We should build him a room, and we should make sure that in his room, he should have a mitah, a bed, a shulchan, a kisei, and a menorah. And the Rav, I'm not going to go through all of it now, through a very interesting sort of comparison of Meforshim, says what the Isha Shunamit was doing was essentially bringing into her home the same sort of messages of the kelim inside the Mishkan, the menorah, the kisei, which according to the Midrash suggests that the kisei is like the kruvim and the aron ha'edut is that, and the mizbeach is the shulchan in the house, meaning that our home should have in it the very same sort of spiritual anchors that the Mishkan had. So when you're looking to create your home, and all of us want to have pretty homes, there's nothing wrong with that. And we're going to make sure that we have this light switch, or we're going to get the perfect fixture. We're going to ask the builder or the contractor to put that wall here, take that wall down, because we want to live in something that's comfortable and aesthetically pleasing, of course. But maybe more important than what is aesthetically pleasing should be spiritually nourishing. That we need to cultivate our ruach, not only our aesthetic sense of enjoyment and feng shui in the way in which the room moves. And so when you put into your home all the things that you put into your home, you must also put into your home the kelim that were there. There has to be a source of Torah, and there has to be a source of sitting around a table in chesed. There has to be a place where all of those messages, and the Rav says, for example, the bed, the Shunamit says that there has to be a bed. So what does bed represent? Tara de mishpacha. The bed, the holy bed, the intimate moments between a husband and a wife is the way in which we talk about a certain sense of purity and sanctity that we bring into our homes. And what does the shulchan represent? Well, shulchan represents obviously not just the food that we eat, but the people around, sitting around the table with us. I heard a fascinating minhag that was done many, many years ago, maybe centuries ago in France, that when a person died, they made the coffin out of their dining room table. Isn't that interesting? Why? So that the table which they used to fulfill the mitzvah of hachnasat chesed should surround the person as they transition from olam hazeh to olam haba. I don't know, I'm not advocating it, but it's an interesting idea where it demonstrates that how the furniture in our home plays a role, not just in being utilitarian, being practical, being functional, but also should be very spiritual at its core. Okay. I have a lot more Torah. I'm going to move to this one, and maybe if I have time, I'll go to one more. In chapter 26, Perek Chavav, Pasuk Tetvav, the Torah tells us a lot of the details that apply to the Mishkan. Vasita, I'm looking at Perek Chavav, Pasuk Tetvav, Pasuk 15. Vasita et hakarashim lamishkan atzei shitim omdim. You shall make the planks of the tabernacle of acacia wood standing erect. Omdim. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded that the Mishkan, amongst the other materials, had to use acacia wood. And so Rashi says, so where did they get this wood from? Remember, they're in a desert. So a desert is not particularly a place of lavish forests. So if you're going to tell us or tell the Jewish people that they need to construct the Mishkan and so much of it has to be made out of wood, so where's that coming? You're not going to a lumber yard. So Rashi reminds us that the trees for the Mishkan actually are special trees. And Rashi tells us they came from Yaakov Avinu, who planted trees in Egypt. When he went from Eretz Yisrael to see Yosef and ultimately settled in Egypt, he took trees with him and he planted them in Egypt. So just prior to his death, Yaakov commanded his children to remove these trees that he planted when he arrived in Egypt and take the wood with them when they left Eretz Mitzrayim. Because Yaakov had a moment of Ruach HaKodesh. He had a nevuah, he had a prophecy that Hashem would one day in the future command them to make something, some sort of temple, some sort of Mishkan for which they would require trees. And that the wood would come from these trees that he planted. This Rashi that I'm quoting now is based on a midrash in Sefer Breshit on a pasuk in Parashat Vayigash, Perek Mem Vav 46, that on his way down to Egypt, before Yaakov went to Egypt, he stopped in Be'er Sheva. And he stopped in Be'er Sheva. And the midrash says, why did he stop in Be'er Sheva? To gather cedar wood, to gather the trees that Avram Avinu, his grandfather, had planted many years earlier in Be'er Sheva. And this wood then had a very long history. The Torah says that Avraham planted Vayita Eshel Be'er Sheva. He planted an Eshel. Now, Rashi says, what do you mean, an Eshel? So he says he made sort of like a hotel, an inn there. And at the time, he planted trees there. So Yaakov, on the way to Mitzrayim, stops in Be'er Sheva, cuts down these trees that Avram Avinu himself planted, and he took them with them to Egypt. So these trees, which is provided the wood for the Mishkan, come with yichus. These trees come with yichus. They come with pedigree. Not only do they go back to Yaakov Avinu, they even go all the way back to Avram Avinu. So with this background, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, the late Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Torah V'dat in New York, in his collection of ideas and commentary to the Parsha called Emet LiYaakov, says the following. What is the meaning of the verse that I just read to you that Hashem told Moshe, you have to build these planks, shitim omdim, which means standing erect? So the Gemara in Masechet Sukkah, says Rav Kamenetsky, explains that Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded to use the wood omdim, stand, or standing forever. These have to be trees that can withstand. They should not be burnt. They should not be destroyed. They would never be captured. They would never warp. So Moshe was said, you use a type of tree that will stand forever. That would omed le'olam ul'omei omaya. This is what the Gemara says. These trees have to be eternal almost. So Moshe Rabbeinu was thinking to himself, now how am I supposed to do this? How am I supposed to build with boards that I know that I can guarantee will never be destroyed, will never be captured? So Moshe is thinking, well, it really doesn't even depend on me. It depends on the Jewish people, because if they end up taking a turn and don't listen to Hashem, then they're going to have to pay the price. The Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed. So Moshe was given a mission that sounded like it just Impossible. You can't do this. So maybe the answer is this, and Rabbi Franz suggests this. Maybe the answer is that Moshe was being told, don't just take any trees. I know you need wood, but in order to fulfill this mission, you can't just take any tree. Take the trees that Yaakov planted, which he received from Avraham Avinu. These trees will, in fact, last forever. Why? Because since those trees were originally planted and used for a mitzvah, don't forget, Avraham Avinu planted them there for the purposes of inviting people to this inn, sitting them down, giving them food, talking to them about the presence of God in their lives. He had a plan. This was not just a tree, so he wanted shade. He wanted it to be a place that he could use for Torah teaching. So they were used for Kedusha, they were used for sanctity. That meant, says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, that they will in fact last forever. Something that is made for a purpose that is holy, which is built from the beginning with the most pure and pristine intentions, that exists. So there's Gemara in Masechet Bava Metzia, 85, that Rav Chia stated, this is such a lovely, I think, Gemara, that Rav Chia stated he was going to ensure that the Torah would be never forgotten from Israel. Okay, pretty bold. So this was very bold. So how? So the reason we are here today learning Torah, according to is Rav Chia. So we're all here on the Zoom call in Toronto, or wherever you're at, because of Rav Chia. How is that so? Because Rav Chia said, I'm going to do something that's going to last. So what did he do? He taught young children Torah. He taught children, according to the Gemara, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah and the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, and he taught it to them, and they taught it to others. But how did he know that it would last forever? So maybe it would last for 1 generation, 2 generations, 3, 4, 5, but how did Rav Chia know that he could make that statement, it's going to last forever? Was it just a hopeful statement? Was it a declaration, or was it a tefillah? Yibbono Shalom, please let it last forever. So the Gemara explains that Rav Chia didn't just sit down with the children, open up a chumash, as it were, and teach them. The Gemara says this, listen to this, it's really a beautiful idea. He planted flax, from which he made nets, with which he caught deer. And then he skinned the deer, and he made hides. And on the hides, he wrote the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Now, why did he go through all this trouble? He wasn't satisfied with just teaching it the way they always taught Chumash. No, he wasn't satisfied just buying a piece of parchment and writing it like they did a regular Torah scroll. That also would have created the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. That wasn't good enough for him. He planted the flax to make the nets to catch the deer, to provide the hides, because that was his guarantee that this Torah would last forever. His motives were pure from the very beginning. With this type of intense commitment, the results last. The results last. And so I think what the story is trying to tell us is that Rabbi Kamenetsky is trying to tell us was the message to Moshe Rabbeinu was to build a Mishkan from Atzei Shitim Omdim. It's got to be with the sort of endurance ability inherent in it. But what makes it inherent? What makes something endure? You need to obtain the type of wood that will last forever. And where do you get that wood from? It's not so hard at this point. You don't go to the lumber yard. You go to Yaakov Avinu. You go to Yaakov Avinu. You go to the Zeta. You go to the great-grandfather. You go to the things that came down to us. You build from what we know. We don't have to start from scratch. We ought not to start from scratch. The first Beit HaMikdash was so much more glorious than the Mishkan It's true. It's in Sefer Melachim. It was beautiful. But what? But it was built by non-Jews. Shlomo HaMelech got non-Jews to build the first Beit HaMikdash. Hiram, the king, Melech of Tyre. And he contributed. He sent his workers. So as much as it was gorgeous, it was beautiful, it was aesthetically pleasing, it was missing that purity that Rav Chia invested in what he did. And certainly the Beis HaMikdash did have a Kedusha. I'm not saying it didn't. But if you want to create something that will last forever, you have to imbue and invest a certain sort of Kedusha to it from the very beginning. And that's why I think these trees lasted. And I think it's a message for everybody. It's not just the building. It's what goes into the building. And what goes into the relationships. When Rabbi Chia sat down with the kids and the kids were watching the Rebbe go through all these steps, they understood something. They understood that look how much he's doing. It must be valuable. His time. He loves us and he loves what he's doing enough. And so I think the question for all of us is, are we planting? In 50 years, in 70 years, in 100 years, what will be cut down to be used by those grandchildren, next generation from us? And I want to be very clear here. I don't want anyone to think that this is just about children, meaning, well, everybody on the call is somebody's child, but maybe not everybody in the call has their own child. So is this message just for parents and grandparents, leaving out that whole segment? I don't think so. Now, there's an interesting Rashi in the very beginning of Parshat Noach, where it talks about Elliott toldot Noach. And Rashi makes, I think, a very profound comment. And he says, Toldot tzadikim heim hama'asim tovim. The generations of a tzaddik is what? Not just his kids, maybe not his kids, but it is his ma'asim tovim. All of us are capable of generating new generations of ma'asim tovim. And I think that's the idea. When people see how we lead our lives and the commitment we're investing in it, that has an impact. It has a very deep impact. And I think this part of the story of Shitim Omdim is that message. And Yehi Ratzon, may Hashem give us the wisdom, give us the strength, give us the Ratzon, the will to invest that passion, to believe that what we're doing today with strength of conviction and overcoming what obviously are going to be difficulties for each and every one of us. We all have our own difficulties. But when people see that we're doing these things and committed to it, that creates the toldot that Rashi is talking about. That creates the generations in the future. And Yehi Ratzon, just like Moshe Rabbeinu merited building a Mishkan because of a previous generation's investment and commitment, so too may the generations whom we don't even think of now, will never meet in this world, may they have the merit to build their life on the things that we plant, that we grow. Thanks everybody for joining me tonight. So everybody unmute yourselves, and happy to share some.
Beautifully done.
What a message.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, everybody. It's one of those parshas that you think, oh my God, this is going to be a
Very deep,
parsha.
very deep.
Scratch away in the Chachamim. Wow, they find things here that are so, for me at least, they're so enriching, inspiring. I hope I could convey some of that to you tonight.
You certainly,
Certainly did. Thank you.
you always do.
Thank you.
Right.
What a nice compliment. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hopefully the weather will hold up and I'll see you on Shabbos.
Oh, that's a treat. That's great.
It's
Wow.
too cold. I'm not allowed to be out.
I tried that too,
What
but
happens
Michelle
when you
keeps
get a
telling me
little
I
bit
have
older?
to go. I'm the rabbi. It didn't work.
Be well, Rabbi. Thank you.
Well, everybody, have a safe week, a healthy week, a bracha week, a chesed week.
You too.
Amen.
you too.
Thank
Good
you for
night.
that.
Good night.
Thank you.
And finally,
Same to
Chodesh
you.
Tov.
Chodesh Tov, everybody. Exactly. Chodesh Tov.
Oh, that's
That is
tough.
so.
Chodesh Tov. Hi, Brenda. Thanks
That
for
is
joining.
tough.
Roy, thanks for joining. Charlie, good to see you. Eva,
Rabbi,
thank you for being here. Marika, I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you, Andy.
Rabbi,
Yes,
can I make a comment about the ephod?
with the
About the
ephod?
ephod.
Yeah.
Ephod, yeah. I was just wondering, maybe the reason it was separated was because it was really not part of the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash could be built. The ephod was separate and really was intended for a method of communication after it was built, and all those other things had to be in place for it to be functional.
So it's a possibility. I'm not certainly going to say no. I'm sharing one series of thoughts on it from the Or Chaim HaKadosh, but that could also be possible.
I was thinking it complemented some of those other three perspectives.
Yeah, could be. Thank you for sharing that, Andrew. Appreciate that.
Take care.
You too.
You know, Rabbi Diamond,
Hi.
hi. Something very interesting that has always remained in my mind about the Kruvim. I used to teach about Egyptian art way back in university. And it was amazing to me, I was sitting here and thinking, Sharon, where did you find the image that you used to show on the screen to your students in this course that I gave called the Jewish Experience in Art at Concordia University in Montreal?
Okay.
It was a photograph that I took in some place of Egyptian art that preceded the Beit HaMikdash in terms of its dating. And there were two angels facing each other with, the hands in the position that the Kruvim, who we're familiar with, were. And I thought, oh my goodness, here's another precedent for the Beit HaMikdash. And I found other things, like for the Shulchan, I found in the architectural not magazine, journal that I used to get a shulchan, a table with lions at the corner. I found many things in the Beit HaMikdash that had precedence in earlier surrounding cultures. And I realize that we borrow and use in different ways that which we need to suit our own new needs.
Yeah,
And your lecture tonight has been such a help to me, because I don't care where the origin of anything in the Beit HaMikdash comes from, whether it originated with Bezalel or whether it was really influenced by earlier surrounding cultures and carried over to the new needs of the Beit HaMikdash. What you taught us today about the transcending of the values really meant so much to me, because this issue is going to bother me less than it has throughout the years. I want to thank you so much.
I appreciate that comment. It means so much that you said that. Thank you very much, Sharon. I really appreciate that. Honestly, truly.
Rabbi,
I'm glad.
one question.
Yes,
Kruvim were before Beit HaMikdash. That was in the desert.
Yeah.
Before Beit HaMikdash. So whatever happened, I believe, with the Egyptians, they did was after the Jewish people left, and they took it not from the Beit HaMikdash, but they took it from the desert, from what happened before the Beit HaMikdash, the Aron Kodesh. What they built first were the Kruvim in the desert. So maybe I would like to think that the Egyptians, whatever they did, they took it from us.
okay. I can't. I can't date anything. I don't know.
It's just thinking. I'm just thinking.
It's an interesting thought. sometimes when we teach Chumash, we study Chumash, and we delve deeply into the text and to the narrative and the way in which our tradition encounters the text, we sometimes forget that there are a lot of things happening in the world around us. So we don't always understand that as we were experiencing this, it's possible that other cultures were experiencing other things that might have had some commonality to it. I would imagine that whether or not you were Jewish or Egyptian, you used the table. And so it's likely that tables had some sort of cultural significance to Egyptians too, because everybody uses the table and everybody needed a source of light. And I didn't even talk about the menorah. So there may be certain elements of our human experience which are unique to us as Jews, and there may be elements of our human experience which are common amongst other peoples. And how their interplay unfolds is, I mean, there's a lot of scholars who talk about that. And we sometimes don't necessarily think about that as much when we're focusing mostly on textual analysis as opposed to seeing this within a context of a world history. But I mean, so I don't know, Simcha, how to answer in terms of the dating of that. I honestly don't know. I'll have to leave that to those people who are experts in the field.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a healthy week. Thanks for joining tonight. I really appreciate it. And God will. Oh my God, I forgot to mention. Next Tuesday, we will not have a class. I have a school function that I have to be there all of the evening. So February the 8th, I should have said this at the beginning and I forgot. February the 8th, we will not have a class. So you're on your own for the next Parsha. Okay, Terumah Tetzaveh. Do your own reading. Okay, thanks everybody. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye. Good night.